Hollywood is obsessed with franchises. Every studio wants the next Star Wars, the next Marvel Cinematic Universe, the next billion-dollar saga that can run for decades. But for every franchise that succeeds, there are dozens that die instantly. Huge films built to launch entire cinematic universes that collapsed after a single movie. Hundreds of millions of dollars invested, years of development, entire sequel plans already mapped out, and then the movie releases and everything falls apart. Today we're looking at movies that didn't just flop, they killed the franchise before it even had a chance to live. Let's start with The Golden Compass. In the mid 2000s, studios were desperate to replicate the success of Harry Potter and The Lord of the Rings, and New Line Cinema believed they had found the next major fantasy franchise in Philip Pullman's novel His Dark Materials. The first film, The Golden Compass, had a huge budget at around 180 million, with tens of millions more spent on marketing. It had everything a blockbuster franchise needs: a beloved book series, a major cast including Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig, cutting-edge visual effects. The film even won the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, but financially it was a disaster. The movie made about 372 million worldwide, which might sound respectable, but because of its massive budget and marketing costs, the studio barely made any profit domestically. In fact, New Line Cinema had already planned sequels adapting the rest of Pullman's trilogy, but after the disappointing performance, those plans were quietly abandoned. The franchise died after a single film. Ironically, the story eventually found new life over a decade later as the HBO series His Dark Materials, but as a movie franchise, The Golden Compass never recovered. After John Carter failed to spark a new mega franchise, Disney tried again the very next year. The Lone Ranger reunited the team behind Pirates of the Caribbean. Director Gore Verbinski, producer Jerry Bruckheimer, Johnny Depp as Tonto. On paper, it looked like a guaranteed blockbuster, but the budget ballooned to 225 to 250 million, with another 150 million spent on marketing. The movie made only 260 million worldwide, and industry analysts estimated losses of 160 to 190 million. Critics attacked the film's strange tone, a mix of dark violence and slapstick comedy, while audiences simply ignored it. The studio had hoped to launch a new blockbuster Western franchise. Instead, it became one of the most expensive bombs ever made. Sometimes a single film kills an entire cinematic universe. That's exactly what happened with The Mummy in 2017. Universal had enormous plans for its dark universe. They wanted a shared universe featuring Dracula, Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, and more. They even released promotional photos with stars like Tom Cruise, Johnny Depp, Russell Crowe, and Javier Bardem. The idea was clear: build a Marvel-style monster franchise, but the very first movie collapsed. Despite a budget of somewhere between 125 and 195 million, the film received poor reviews and underperformed in the US box office. It made 410 million worldwide, but because of massive production and marketing costs, it still lost somewhere between 60 and 95 million. Almost immediately, Universal cancelled the Dark Universe. One film, one universe, gone. Another attempted franchise reboot was the Power Rangers movie, which was supposed to launch a 6-film series. Yes, the studio publicly talked about 6 movies, but the first film struggled. It grossed 142 million worldwide on a budget of around 100 million, ultimately losing about 74 million once marketing and distribution were included. Critics were mixed, audiences were lukewarm, and the franchise plans disappeared. Sometimes the problem is the concept itself. Universal's Battleship attempted to turn a classic board game into a blockbuster action franchise. The studio spent around 200 million on the film, but despite a worldwide gross of roughly 303 million, the film reportedly lost nearly 200 million after costs. Critics mocked the premise, audiences didn't connect with it, and the planned franchise never happened. Even Rihanna can't save a franchise killer. Then there's Mortal Engines. Produced by Peter Jackson and based on a popular young adult novel series, the film was clearly designed to launch a new fantasy franchise. The world building was enormous, cities mounted on giant moving machines devouring each other, but the film cost about 100 million and only made around 83 million worldwide, becoming one of the biggest losses of the decade. Sequels were quietly cancelled, another cinematic universe gone. Sometimes a movie doesn't just flop, it completely changes a studio strategy. That's what happened with The Amazing Spider-Man 2. After rebooting Spider-Man in 2012 with Andrew Garfield, Sony had massive plans for the franchise. They weren't just thinking about sequels, they were building an entire cinematic universe, with spin-offs centred on characters like Venom and the Sinister Six. But the second film quickly ran into trouble. Despite a massive £200 million production budget, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 made about 708 million worldwide, which sounds impressive until you compare it to the earlier Spider-Man films. It became the lowest grossing Spider-Man movie of the modern era, and critics widely complained about its overcrowded story, messy tone, and excessive setup for future films. Some audiences agreed and felt the same. The movie had clearly been designed as a launching pad for multiple spin-offs, but instead it did the opposite. Sony cancelled the planned sequels and eventually struck a deal with Marvel Studios to reboot the character yet again, this time bringing Spider-Man into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In other words, one disappointing sequel forced Sony to completely rethink the future of one of the most valuable superheroes in cinema. Then there's the Divergent series, one of the clearest examples of a franchise collapsing mid-story. During the early 2010s, Hollywood was chasing the success of The Hunger Games, hoping to turn every young adult dystopian novel into the next billion-dollar series. And at first it worked. The first two Divergent films performed reasonably well at the box office, but when the studio decided to split the final book into two movies, just like Harry Potter and The Hunger Games had done, audiences began to lose interest. The third film, the Divergent series Allegiant, was where everything fell apart. With a budget of about 110 million, the film only made around 179 million worldwide, far below expectations. Critics were harsh, calling the movie dull and directionless, and audience enthusiasm dropped sharply. Originally, the plan was to finish the story with a fourth theatrical film. Instead, the studio quietly cancelled it. There were attempts to wrap up the series with a television movie, but even that never happened. The franchise simply stopped. A story designed as a four-film saga ended with no conclusion at all. Finally, one of the most ambitious franchise attempts of the last decade was King Arthur: Legend of the Sword. Warner Brothers had huge plans for this project. Director Guy Ritchie was hired to launch a six-film cinematic universe based on the legend of King Arthur. The idea was to build an epic fantasy saga around the Knights of the Round Table, but the very first film stumbled out of the gate. With a production budget of around 175 million, the movie needed to make well over 400 million just to break even. Instead, it grossed only about 148 million worldwide. Critics were mixed, audiences were confused by the film's strange tone, and the box office was disastrous. Almost immediately, Warner Bros. Cancelled the entire planned franchise. All six films, gone. What was supposed to be a massive cinematic universe ended after a single movie. Looking at all these films, a pattern emerges. Most franchise killers share a few key problems. Massive budgets. When a movie costs 250 million, it needs to make 600 to 700 million just to break even. Confusing marketing. If audiences don't understand the concept immediately, they won't buy tickets. And finally, overconfidence from the studios. Studios often plan entire cinematic universes before the first movie even releases, and if that first movie fails, the whole strategy collapses. Hollywood loves franchises, but history shows how fragile they really are, because sometimes it only takes one movie to kill an entire cinematic universe.